Well, thank you, Danny, and thanks, team, for leading us in worship this morning. It has been a wonderful weekend for me and my family to be back here in a place that I was here a number of years ago, and just with a lot of familiar faces, and had a lot of fun as well, including having some snow volleyball yesterday that really zonked me in, so I had a great night's sleep as well. I hope the same was true for many of you. So as Danny alluded to, we've been looking at this idea of what it means to bear witness in a post-Christian context, and we've been reflecting on the fact that there's actually a lot of overlap in terms of some of the experiences and the needs or the calling that God has placed upon us between our current context, where Christianity is on the decline and a lot of changes are going on in our society that make a lot of Christians feel anxious about the future, and the Israelites when they were taken into captivity by the Babylonians and went through the experience of the exile. So while our experience is not nearly as extreme as what they faced, I think there's a lot of the same questions about our identity and our purpose in this context. And we've been looking specifically at a message given by the prophet Jeremiah to the exiles as the foundation for our teaching, in which he called the exiled Israelites to trust God to restore them, to serve the common good even of their oppressors, and to be wary of false prophets. And we've worked through these one by one over the course of the weekend, first considering what it looks like to trust God to restore us and how we can do that, and then considering how to serve the common good, even of our oppressors. And today, we're going to be reflecting more on this idea of being wary of false prophets. Now, I think it's worth noting that I'm using a very broad definition of prophet here, since the kinds of people that I'll refer to aren't all self-proclaimed messengers from God, although there are some of those in the mix as well. So we need to be mindful. There are some who see themselves as prophets, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are actually good counsel from God. In wrapping up and considering what relevance this idea has for our current circumstance, I want to go back to the passage that I got these 3 points from and just again look at Jeremiah's letter to the exiled Israelites and revisit it, since we've now been going deeper into some of those ideas, and see the core concepts that he's given us to consider in this instance. So looking at Jeremiah 29, verses 4 to 14, here's what Jeremiah wrote to his fellow Israelites as he and they went through the exile. He wrote, "This is what the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says to all the exiles I deported from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Find wives for yourselves and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters to men in marriage so that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there. Do not decrease. Pursue the well-being of the city I have deported you to. Pray to the Lord on its behalf, for when it thrives, you will thrive. For this is what the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says. Don't let prophets who are among you and your diviners deceive you, and don't listen to the dreams you elicit from them, for they are prophesying falsely to you in my name. I have not sent them. This is the Lord's declaration. For this is what the Lord says. When 70 years for Babylon are complete, I will attend to you and will confirm my promise concerning you to restore you to this place. For I know the plans I have for you. This is the Lord's declaration. Plans for your well-being, not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope. You will call to me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. I will be found by you. This is the Lord's declaration, and I will restore your fortunes and gather you from all the nations and places where I banished you. This is the Lord's declaration. I will restore you to the place from which I deported you." So here's what I'd like to consider this morning as we revisit this passage and think more broadly about the themes that we've considered, and then specifically about this idea of resisting false prophets. First, I want to recap a little by talking about what are the core ideas that we have drawn out of these passages. I know it can be easy to forget when you've been here all weekend, as well as we're bringing some new people on board with us today. So I think it's good to recap some of the core ideas. Then I want to consider, how does the false prophet's message compare to those ideas? And then third, I would like to consider, how should Christians engage in politics in Canada today? Because this is one of the big contentious issues that we see a lot of people debating today. So these are the three questions I'd like to try and answer for you here this morning. Hopefully a little glimpse at how I think, anyways, we ought to navigate our cultural circumstance in line with what Jeremiah instructed the exiled Israelites. So first of all, what are the core ideas that we've drawn out of these passages so far over the course of this weekend? And as I mentioned, we've really looked at the two first elements of what it is that Jeremiah has challenged his fellow Israelites to do: to trust God to restore them instead of trying to fix their circumstances themselves, and to serve the common good, even of their oppressors. And we talked about the fact that we cultivate trust in God by worshiping Him. And we talked about what exactly worship is, and I talked about the idea that really it's practicing the presence of God. Worship means focusing on God's presence in the midst of everything that we go through. Then we talked about the idea that we serve the common good by working to make the world a more harmonious place. And while I didn't use the word, I put forward what I would call contextualization as the core of this. I think creating harmony requires identifying where our community's needs intersect with our abilities and God's values. And when those three things come together, there we can do really meaningful work to make the world a more harmonious place. We also talked about the fact that idols are one of the primary interferers with this. When we don't worship God, but instead put other things, even good things, in the ultimate place in our life, our work serves idols instead, and that undermines everyone's well-beings. And I would argue that that's actually the state that the world around us exists in, is pursuing idols instead of pursuing God. And our witness is about helping point people back towards God in our worship and our work. So that's the core ideas that we've talked about over the last couple of sessions. So then how does the false prophet's message compare to those ideas that I've put forward over the course of our series? Well, I think what we see when we look at how Jeremiah summarizes the false prophet's message, we see that they place undue importance on the negative circumstance the Israelites face. In their eyes, the circumstances are so bad that it can't possibly be God's will. And therefore, instead of trusting Him to do the restoring, the Israelites need to do everything in their power to change it and look for the quickest escape possible from their circumstance. This isn't unique to Jeremiah. All through the Old Testament, we see false prophets and the kings they advise forming alliances, bribing people, and even embracing pagan worship to try and fix the bad situations that they face. But it doesn't. Instead, it always makes the bad situation worse. That's a repeating occurrence in the life of Israel. They think, we've got to take things into our own hand because we're not sure God can even get us out of this mess. And that always actually makes the mess worse. So the false prophets, I think, are placing too much importance on the negative circumstances instead of seeing God as the one who is sovereign and able to rescue. Alongside that, I think the false prophets see the world as a zero-sum game, in which the Israelites can only gain at their enemy's expense, and vice versa. When the Israelites find themselves surrounded by enemies, therefore, their task is not to seek their enemy's well-being, but to fortify themselves against further onslaught and to fight to regain what they lost as soon as possible. There's this embattled mindset that we find the prophets advocating for when it comes to their life alongside other nations, because I think they see it as a zero-sum game. They win or we win. There's no middle ground. And again, this is not unique to the circumstance faced by Jeremiah. Throughout the Old Testament, we see false prophets and the kings they advise overestimating Israel's importance and uniqueness and denying God's love or sovereignty over the affairs of other nations. And this has the effect of increasing their animosity for one another. So, what we see here, I think, is a pattern where the false prophets, instead of encouraging the Israelites to trust God to restore them and worship Him rightly, and instead of encouraging them to seek the common good even of their oppressors, to do the good work that they are called to in whatever context they find themselves in. They advocate for a different way of being, one that focuses on trying to scrape by with whatever power they can gain so they can undo this horrible circumstance they find themselves in, and denying God's love for the people that they are alongside. You might call this the Jonah complex, because he embodies this tendency to overstate the negative and to underestimate God's glory and grace in the midst of his circumstances. So my conclusion, like the prophet Jeremiah's, is that these false prophets aren't really from God at all. Because even though they would certainly proclaim they are coming in the name of the Lord, they are worshiping Yahweh, the one true God, I think they're actually idolaters. They've put other things ahead of God. They see other things as greater and more important than the work that God is doing in their midst. And I think in particular, they're actually consumed by a thirst for power, alongside the things they think that it will bring them, such as comfort and success relative to their enemies. I think this is the plight of the Israelites and the message of the false prophets. So then we turn to our context, and I want to consider how Christians are to engage in politics. That didn't change I think my PowerPoint's a little out of date. It should say, how are Christians to engage in politics here in our context today? And this is something that's been the source of a lot of debate, a lot of tension between people within our culture. I think what we see is that there are two truths in tension that shape our lives in this post-Christian context. And they both stem from the fact that we live in a democracy. Because we live in a democracy, Christians, like everyone else, are supposed to express their opinion on how the country should be run. That's actually part of what it means to exist in our society. We aren't supposed to totally renounce any involvement in the governing of affairs. And this is a little complicated because Christians throughout history often didn't have any power, but we have some just by being in a democracy and being citizens of it. At the same time, as Christians make up less and less of the Canadian electorate, they will have less and less influence on how our society is actually run. And this creates a deep tension in terms of how people respond to our context. How are we supposed to respond to it? Well, I think we see that there are some who would advocate what we need to do is take as much power back as possible for ourselves. That the thing that we need to be able to fix our culture is for Christians to be in charge. And I think that sounds a lot like the message of the false prophets. Instead, I would put forward my suggested response to the circumstances we find ourselves in is that, first of all, we should cherish our rights and exercise our responsibilities as long as they remain in place. And I, for one, believe there's still a lot that we have going for us in our context, despite the fact that we are decreasing in our influence and our position within our society. And then I suggest, probably unsurprisingly, that we follow Jeremiah's advice to the Israelites. And this includes being careful about false prophets who are proclaiming this need for power. Here are two tests I would put forward, two things that for me are red flags when it comes to people preaching how Christians ought to respond to our current moment. First of all, beware of the tyranny of the urgent. What do I mean by that? One of the ways that people will manipulate your emotions is by telling you that if you don't act now, everything will be ruined. That if you don't respond and do what they're telling you, then people will suffer, and maybe our society will irreversibly go downhill. And by upping your sense of urgency, they're decreasing your sense of agency. I can think through carefully what I ought to do and choose based on that how I'm going to respond to the circumstance. No, if you think a bear is about to eat your child, you just respond. And that's the part of your brain that people are trying to activate when they up the sense of urgency. Emergency, emergency, go, act, and do what I tell you. To me, immediately, I recoil from that and say, that's a red flag. To me, I'm not sure this is really reflective of God's will for us. Alongside that, I take this from a lyric from a song by a band named Gungor. They use the phrase, it's not us or them, it's us for them. And to me, this really captures an important part of what it is that Jeremiah is calling the Israelites to, and I think God is calling us to in our context. If people are telling you that your task is to bunker down and resist your enemies, to fight back against them, whoever them is, and creating a worldview that's built around us versus them, that doesn't sound like the voice of God. That doesn't sound like Jesus, who would say, love your enemies as yourself. That sounds like a false prophet to me. Whereas when people say, what can we do to be on the side of those who are different than ourselves? How can we come alongside them, to ally with them, to make their lives better, that we might all flourish? That to me sounds like the message Jeremiah is preaching, and Jesus preached, and the Bible points us towards in general. So these two principles, beware of the tyranny of the urgent, and it's not us or them, it's us for them, shape the way that I think about engaging in politics in our culture. And I want to specify, this is not a left versus right thing. I see people on both sides of the political spectrum using these same tactics, and often they are actually people of Christian conviction. I, who was raised in an evangelical context, tend to associate Christianity with conservatism, so that's the branch of politics that I'm most used to. But one of the things I've come to realize is actually there's a whole other branch of Christianity that often leans left instead of leaning right. And some of those Christians would say that's the only right way to be. And so there's often this same thing happening on that side of the political spectrum that happens on the side that my culture tends to lean towards. So here, don't hear me bashing any one particular political group. Instead, I'm trying to talk about a tactic that appears on both sides of the political spectrum that we need to be wary of. What I want to do now is actually consider how these principles play out in various means of political participation. Now, this might seem a little bit odd because often in the church we don't spend a lot of time talking in politics. And that's because you often have a small but very vocal group who are trying to tell you exactly what you should do politically with very, very strong opinions, the people who are preaching this way that I've just been talking about. And so I think often churches recoil from talking about politics at all. Whoa, that's just a messy place where there's all sorts of divisions, and we don't want to go there for fear of rubbing people the wrong way. But one of my convictions has been I want to study and understand how we can engage in politics and as much as possible pass that on to people, because it is an essential part of existing in a democratic society, and the post-Christian part makes it rather complex. So here's some thoughts I have about specific elements of that. Take what you will, leave what you think is not helpful. So one of the elements of participating in democracy is the act of voting. This is one that many of us participate in on a regular basis, and I actually think is a very important part of our civic responsibility in a democracy. Even if you can't find a perfect party to vote for, I think it's important to vote and express your will. But here's the thing. I think there's two different ways of approaching voting that line up with these voices that we've been talking about. The false prophet says, who can we elect that will get me what I want? I know what's best, and I'm going to vote for the person who agrees exactly with what I want. And this has two problems to it. One, it creates a legalism around there only being one candidate. And frankly, I would say, even beyond that, sometimes you just end up at a loss. There is no candidate that I agree with completely. And what are you to do in that circumstance? It can lead to a lot of dissatisfaction and a lack of engagement politically, or you get more and more extreme in how you engage politically because of the fact that you're never truly happy with the options that you have on the table. On the other hand, I think a healthier way of approaching the task of voting is to think, who can we elect that will do the most good for the most people? I think that's actually this common good mindset that Jeremiah is advocating for. We should look and say, okay, I have a set of imperfect options before me, but I do believe that some will be able to do more good than others, so who will do the most good for the most people? I think that's a better way to approach voting and lines up with the prophet Jeremiah's values rather than the false prophets. Another layer of participation in a democratic society is letter writing or petitions. participating in things where groups of people are trying to call attention to a leader about something going on. And this is something that I don't know how many people have engaged in, but I've signed a couple of petitions here and there. This is something I've dipped my toes in a little bit. And I know my mom actually often would correspond with her local MP to try and talk to him about things going on that she was seeing locally. I think this is a healthy way to engage in a democracy. MPs invite this within our system and other layers of government as well. But again, I see that there's a couple different ways that we can approach this cognitively. I think the false prophet says something like, if you express your anger loudly enough, they'll have to change course. Let's do whatever we can to bully them into changing what they're doing. There's a lot of anger, and we're going to just express that as loudly and fiercely as possible. And this is something that's, I think, increased in the age of the internet. And one of the things that bothers me greatly is you hear people in public office talking about how often they receive death threats and other really slanderous statements from people. And it's actually undermining the health of our democracy that people are so full of vitriol for our public servants. What's the other approach? Well, I think right thinking about letter writing and petitions sounds more like this. If you express your concerns respectfully, it may provide our leaders with more information to consider as they decide what to do. That's the value of letter writing. They may not know what somebody like you thinks. They may not know how many people like you are in their constituency. And so it can be very valuable for a leader to hear from people who think differently than themselves. But I would argue we should do so in a way that's respectful and kind towards them and seeks to win their favor rather than treating them as the enemy and attacking them outright. Another form of participation in our democracy is protests, trying to stand up out publicly and declare that we see something as wrong alongside a group of people. And this is something that I'm seeing a lot more of, especially over the period of COVID-19 pandemic. You've seen a lot of people getting very upset about different issues that have been going on around our society. And I've known a lot of Christians who have started participating in protests for the first time in many cases. It's not something they had done up to that point in time. And again, I think this is actually an important part of our system. I think for those who have not ever participated in a protest, we tend to be a little uncomfortable with them. It seems awfully confrontational, and often they cause inconvenience for a lot of people. So we're a little shy around this topic, but we actually have laws that make room for this and even encourage it within our society because it is a form of expressing opinion within our broader society, calling attention to something. That said, again, I think there's two ways of thinking about this. The false prophet might be saying something like, we've got to put a stop to this at all costs. And that begins with the protest itself, where people are expressing things. But the expression might become particularly heated and angry and even violent towards the people that they see as the problem. And often this idea, we've got to put a stop to it at all costs, incentivizes people to go beyond that and even to take more and more extreme action so that the protest spills over into violence against other people in some form or shape. And we've seen more of that in recent years. What is the better way of thinking about this? Well, I think Jeremiah might say something like, we have an opportunity to call attention to something that people ignore at their own peril. That, I think, is the point of a protest. People around us might not even be aware that there is an issue with what's happening right now. And we want to call their attention to it because we actually believe if this continues, it will undermine the health of our whole society and even of the people who are in favor of this particular thing. I think that's a respectful way and a common good approach to protesting against things, and hopefully limits how far we're willing to go to do that, because if we go beyond a certain limit, now we're undermining the common good instead of actually promoting it. Alongside this, something that happens very commonly, that I've been part of a lot as a pastor, is just general conversations about public leaders. This is something that I get into one-on-one with people who ask my opinion about certain things going on, and it's something that comes up even in things like small group Bible studies, where people just get talking about the news, and then suddenly all the strong opinions begin coming out. Again, I don't think this is mere gossip or slander. I think this is actually an important part of participating in a democracy. We are supposed to form opinions about our leaders and do what we can to share those opinions with each other and maybe even shape how each other think about it, because that's how democracies function. We influence each other, and ultimately consensus is built through the electoral process. So we should talk about our leaders. That's a good and healthy thing. But again, I think there's different ways of approaching this. I think the false prophets, the thing that they would say is, they're ruining our society. They're the bad ones. That person's, and they might not say it, but I think it's implied, they're the devil incarnate. I've even heard, they're the Antichrist, or things like that get thrown out there. There's a real slanderous edge to the way that people talk about leaders. And the false prophets encourage this. Yes, they're so bad that we shouldn't pretend. We should just call them out for the evil that they are. I don't think this really serves our society very well or lines up with Christian values. So then how ought we to approach it? Again, I would say something like, hey, look, our leaders have been entrusted with an important responsibility, and I want them to use it well. And maybe I'm concerned that they're not using it well. And so I can share negative opinions, but we recognize this is a hard responsibility they've been given, and I do want them to do well. I have their good in mind, even if I disagree with a particular course of action that they're taking. If you think about some of the conversations you've had around your dinner table or your small group Bible studies, how different would it be if this was the overall tone and spirit of those political conversations? I think it would be much more Christ-like. Last but not least, one form of participation in politics is actually directly getting involved in what I would call partisan politics. Being part of a political party as a member, or giving towards it, or maybe even helping with a campaign, or maybe even running for office yourself. One of the interesting parts about democracies, including Canada, is that we've tended to structure them around people forming parties with a particular allegiance to them, which means to some degree being a team player, saying, I want my team to win, I don't want the other team to win. Just like the world of sports, for example. Nobody's really cheering for the other team. Well, does that just mean that a Christian can't do this? That Christians can't possibly engage in party politics? No, I don't think so. Again, this is actually an important part of how we've structured our society. The way our democratic system works is for people to form parties with like-minded values, and then to try and appeal to people based on those values and to build up consensus over time. So I think as a Christian, we can participate in that freely. It's about the spirit in which we do that. I think the false prophet tends to preach something like this: we're God's team, unlike everybody else. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. And that's a toxic mindset. I think that begins to undermine the health of the electoral system, because everything becomes a no-holds-barred fight to the death against the other parties. That doesn't promote good, common good thinking. But on the flip side, I think we can approach it in a different way, saying, hey, me and my party members, let's do what we can to serve the common good. We have certain convictions about what that looks like. We're going to stand on those convictions, absolutely. But we're going to recognize that all of us are ultimately in it for the same purpose, trying to serve the common good. Let's see if we can actually have the opportunity to do that en masse. I think that's a healthier approach to participation in partisan politics. So again, these are some of the things I've reflected on as somebody who's studied politics as well as theology and tried to navigate a tricky situation as a pastor where I hear strong opinions coming at me from different sides. And I've looked at some of the ways that I and the people around me have engaged in politics, and these are structures that our society has set up for the good of the society. I think we can and should participate in all of them, but we should always carry into it a spirit of seeking the common good and trusting God to work out his will over our context. That changes the way that we engage in politics. I'm going to remind you at the beginning, here's the two principles that I would offer you should be wary of when you're hearing people telling you what to do. Beware of the tyranny of the urgent. When somebody tells them that you have to act now and do exactly what they tell you or else everything's going to fall apart, I think they're often preaching a false gospel. And it's not us or them, it's us for them. When somebody tries to construct a worldview that says it's all about us beating our opponents, that doesn't line up very well with the prophetic message that Jeremiah brings or the message of Jesus Christ himself. I think we ought to instead approach this as how can we serve the people around us, even if they are quite different from ourselves or naturally our enemies. Here's our recap. What are the core ideas we've drawn out of these passages? We talked about the fact that we cultivate trust in God by worshiping Him, and we serve the common good by working to make the world a more harmonious place. Idolatry, on the other hand, undermines everyone's well-being. We talked about how does the false prophet's message compare to those ideas, and I suggested that they idolatrously overstate the importance of Israel's negative circumstances and pit Israel against other nations. And I tried to take these ideas into how we engage in politics in Canada today, saying that we should beware of false urgency and us versus them thinking as we engage in our democratic process. Thanks for having me with you this weekend. It has been a pleasure. I look forward to hearing your thoughts afterwards about this particular message. But for now, I'm going to close in prayer and invite the worship team to close us off with some more songs. Heavenly Father, thank you again for the time we've had together this weekend, where we have been able to share in so much love from our different walks of life, our different convictions, our different experiences, and to learn from each other and from your word. Now I pray that we'd be able to take away some of these ideas and allow it to shape our lives, both individually and communally, as we seek to live in our post-Christian context. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.